Ocarina of Time was released for the Nintendo 64 in the year 1998 as the fifth game in the Legend of Zelda series. Consequently, this is the fifth video in my series of Zelda retrospectives, and it might be worthwhile for you to watch my prior videos if you're a fan of the series. If that's too much catch-up for you, it just so happens that Ocarina of Time marks the beginning of a new chapter for the Zelda series by introducing a third dimension. Just like Super Mario 64 before it, this game breathed new life into a classic Nintendo franchise and permanently altered its DNA moving forward. Even beyond the legacy of Nintendo, Ocarina of Time has staked an irrefutable claim as one of the most influential games ever created. Upon release, the title received universal acclaim, and even today sits comfortably at the top of many greatest of all time lists. Its impact on the industry cannot be overstated, but does it really live up to all that hype today? With such a massive game, in scope as well as legacy, I'm going to try out a new style for this retrospective. Rather than just talk about the different components of the game in a general sense, I want to really dig deep into the experience of playing Ocarina of Time from beginning to end. I'll be playing through the game in the way a typical player might, and along the way I'll voice my thoughts on specific moments rather than on the game as a whole. These could be analysis, anecdotes, or simply bits of trivia I want to share. Think of it more as a beat-by-beat commentary of the game. Of course, I'm still titling the video Ocarina of Time Retrospective, because I'm stubborn about uniformity, and I just really like the word retrospective. Sue me. I'm going to be discussing nearly every aspect of the game in this video. Up to you if you watch without having played the game first. Because I'm going to be zooming into each detail and going through the game comprehensively, this video might still be interesting to those of you who haven't played the game yet, but just be aware that it will likely ruin the experience of playing it yourself, if you were ever to choose to. If you have somehow never played Ocarina of Time and wish to ameliorate that before watching, my recommendation would be to play the 3DS remake. It features massive quality of life improvements, yet never intrudes upon the original game's vision. With that being said, as always, I'll be discussing the original release, warts and all, and won't reference the remake any further. This video will be plenty long already, so let's not waste any more time. The game begins with an opening monologue from the Great Deku Tree, guardian of the forest and its peaceful inhabitants, the Kokiri. One child is singled out and we witness the terrible vision plaguing his sleep, depicted on screen to hook the player with promised action and excitement. The Great Deku Tree warns of a looming evil bringing impending destruction and makes a desperate call to a lowly fairy, Navi, to guide this young boy to become the destined hero that Hyrule needs. I'm sure that the decision to forego full voice acting in Ocarina of Time was originally made out of necessity. The N64 was still cartridge-based like earlier consoles. This offered very fast load times, but also very limited storage capacity compared to disc-based competitors like the Sony PlayStation. To put it kindly, voice acting in video games was of very inconsistent quality during this generation, so this limitation probably did the game a favor in the long run. However, in the absence of voice acting, there is no reason for the on-screen text to crawl at such a snail's pace. It's brutal, and the game offers no options for speeding up or skipping instances of exposition like this. Navi flies through Kokiri Forest in search of her new ward. This brief sequence offers the developers a fun way to show off the capabilities of 3D polygons in creating a more believable world. Because the idea of a camera was new to 3D games, Super Mario 64 contextualized it by having Lakitu follow Mario around to film the action with his literal camera. In this short scene, Ocarina of Time uses a similar trick to ease the player into the idea of a camera by presenting the world from Navi's point of view, complete with a clumsy crash into the fence. In Navi's first interactions with Link, or whatever name the player chose, you might be fooled into thinking she would be treated as a fleshed-out companion on your journey, but that isn't the case. If we are being generous, Navi is a functional aid to the player in reminding them of their current objective between play sessions. But to be frank, she is more of a nuisance with her constant interruptions and that infamously perky. The series would eventually make massive strides in creating complex side characters, but Navi is a mechanical inclusion and little else. When you first gain control of Link in his treehouse, it's accomplished by way of a familiar top-down view, to remind the player of how things used to be before blowing their mind with the 3D playground of Kokiri Forest. The forest is packed with all sorts of clever design inclusions to help players grow accustomed to 3D movement. The narrow walkway above the ground teaches precise control, as well as the idea of verticality. The stepping stones that cross the river show that Link will automatically jump off ledges. The game curiously lacks a jump button. Engaging in these micro-challenges is essentially required in order to earn the 40 rupees needed to purchase a wooden shield. Both the sword and shield are required to leave this tutorial area, and the sword is found within the very on-the-nose Cave of Z, where controlling the camera is explained. The game uses a very simple form of camera control, wherein the camera is centered behind Link anytime the Z button is pressed. This works very elegantly in open spaces, but in tighter areas like this cave, it can get a bit awkward and finicky. Even still, the camera does what is required of it in the majority of situations, and you can't ask for much more in such an early attempt. The system is admittedly difficult to learn today, simply because dual-stick camera control has been the de facto standard across the industry for many years. The rolling boulder here doesn't actually harm Link, so there is no pressure to master camera control right away, as I'm sure the skill did not come easily to players of the day. The path to the Great Deku Tree is guarded by the game's first set of enemies, the Deku Babas. These stationary monsters are the perfect introductory enemy, as they don't give chase and as such don't put any pressure on the player. Unlike the wide slash of Link to the Past, it can be tricky to line up a sword swipe in 3D, but players have as much time as they need here. In his Shakespearean English, the Great Deku Tree entreats Link to vanquish the sickness within his trunk, and with that the game's first dungeon begins. The first room is a massive multi-story chamber that immediately differentiates the dungeons of a 3D Zelda game from those of a 2D. This dungeon has a massive focus on verticality, befitting the first 3D dungeon of the series. In fact, almost all the puzzles and challenges within can be solved by the simple act of looking up or down. From the entrance to the dungeon, you spiral around the walls of the central room, climbing higher and higher and exploring the smaller adjacent rooms as you go. The slingshot is acquired early and put to great use in clearing out the skulltulas blocking your climbing paths, or those waiting to drop from above. The eureka moment of the dungeon comes when you reach the top of the chamber and put the pieces together in your mind to fall through the thick cobweb on the ground level, something that simply wouldn't be possible in a 2D game. The second half of the dungeon isn't as memorable and consists of mostly simple single-room puzzles that reintroduce recurring mechanics that will be expanded on throughout the game, stuff like moving blocks and lighting torches. Combat hasn't become a focus yet, but Link is faced with his first mobile foes in these spider larvae. It can be challenging enough keeping a moving monster on screen, and forget about lining up your sword slash consistently. This is where Z-targeting comes in, by taking camera concerns out of the equation. Combat is given a more cinematic angle once locked on, and Link unlocks a more combat-oriented moveset full of sidesteps, backflips, and jump attacks. This form of targeting is still used in 3D action games today, and they all have Ocarina of Time to thank for introducing it. It may not seem that special from our modern vantage, but this was a revolutionary innovation for the time. All players will eventually come to rely on Z-targeting in this game, but if newcomers aren't quite ready for that leap yet, the plentiful Deku nuts can be used to turn a mobile foe into a stationary target. Upon entering a large empty chamber in the heart of the dungeon, and hearing an unnerving crunching noise above, it is up to the player to initiate the boss fight by looking up. I love how much personality is given to the bosses in this game. The monstrous spider is presented with a full title: Parasitic Armored Arachnid, Queen Goma. Goma isn't a new creation for this game. She was originally fought in the first Legend of Zelda game, over a decade before Ocarina of Time's release, but the complexity of this fight just shows how far the series has come in that time. The slingshot can be used to open Goma up to attack, by targeting the one chink in her armor, her eye. Zelda bosses having a giant eye as a weak point eventually became a tired trope in later games, but Goma began this trend, so you can't hold it against her. After taking some damage, the queen retreats to the ceiling and lays eggs in an attempt to overwhelm the player with those spider larvae from earlier in the dungeon. The fight can be over really quickly if you push the offensive, but I like to slow down to appreciate all of the work that went into her design. I loved the big boss sprites found in Link to the Past, but they don't hold a candle to the feel of fighting a larger-than-life monster in 3D. These bosses have so much more of an in-game presence, and really come to life despite the antiquated visuals. Back outside of the dungeon, we get a bit more detail on this evil force you are destined to overcome. You and I know this is Ganondorf, an overused villain throughout the series, but it's still kept vague here. Remember that players in the 90s were only familiar with the monstrous pig Ganon, so this grim-looking outsider's identity was a complete mystery. The Great Deku Tree, with his dying breath, recounts Hyrule's creation myth. 3 goddesses representing power, wisdom, and courage sculpted this world and all that inhabit it. The 3 left behind a sacred power, the Triforce, and this is what our villain is after. The concept of the Triforce would be well known by fans of the previous games, but all of this extra lore is brand new and really intriguing. I love how much Ocarina of Time expands upon the familiar beats of Link to the Past in particular. Speaking of familiar beats, it's off to Hyrule Castle to meet up with Princess Zelda. Departing Kokiri Forest has the same feel of the hobbits journeying out of the Shire. It's about leaving childhood and innocence behind in the face of encroaching evil. Very fairy tale-esque. Saying farewell to your childhood friend Saria is a bittersweet moment, and it's impressive that these primitive visuals can elicit emotional responses like this. Saria gives you an ocarina, not of time, and wishes you well on your journey. Don't worry, this isn't really goodbye. We'll be seeing more of her before long. After leaving the safety of the forest, we are immediately accosted by the owl Kapora Gabora, a fun callback to the owl who guided Link through the dream world of Koholint Island in the previous game. Like Navi, his inclusion is functional more than anything, always appearing to direct you to the main objective or provide some story background. He has this funny quirk where he asks the player if they would like to hear his spiel again in a different way each time, so you really have to be careful when selecting yes or no. I always get a little chuckle at my own expense when I make the wrong selection and have to endure his excruciatingly slow text speed again. It's hard not to be impressed with the size of Hyrule Field upon first exploring it. This central area acts as a hub, connecting all of the different locales of Hyrule, which extend outward like branches. This is decidedly different from the map designs of the previous games, and warrants some inspection. Zelda 1, Link to the Past, and Link's Awakening all had very compact grid layouts with little negative space. Ocarina, on the other hand, is mostly a collection of connected corridors, which never intersect. Players will quickly realize how tedious this makes traversal. Fast travel is more important in this game than ever before. The first Dark Souls is a wonderful example of what an interconnected 3D map could look like, but Ocarina just isn't there yet. I would be more critical if each individual area wasn't so well realized and distinct, so I'll let Nintendo off the hook here. Outside of some traditional Zelda secrets like bombable walls, there isn't much to do in the field itself, but it does do the heavy lifting in giving the game the epic scope it is known for. The map feels so much bigger than it really is, in part because of the massive filler in the center. It's definitely a case of corner cutting, but I would be lying if it didn't produce the desired effect. We also get a glimpse of the dynamic day-night cycle added to this game. This is effective at making Ocarina's world more alive than it otherwise would be, but it isn't put to great use. That would have to wait for the sequel. Often the game will cheat by freezing time in areas like Kakariko Village, so that it doesn't have to depict the transition between 2 very distinct versions of the village. If you enter during the day, you get the day version of the village for the duration of your stay, and the same for the night version. Outside of some very isolated cases, the game really only differentiates between the binary day and night. For example, in Hyrule Field at night we have to fight off Stalfos until the sun rises and the gates to Castletown open. There are many other routes open to us already, but let's just head straight to Zelda. The courtyard of Castletown is bustling with NPCs. They don't have much to say, but it's always fun to interact with everyone regardless. Most of the shops are closed right now, but later on this will be the home of many of the game's side quests and minigames, such as a shooting range and Bombchu Bowling. The main square is another case of the game cheating to overcome technical limitations. You'll notice the camera suddenly switch to a forced perspective when you enter the area. It's a bit jarring, isn't it? This allows the devs to forego full models for each building, and instead just use still images to set the scene. You can very easily see the stark contrast between the NPCs, which are actual entities, and the static background. To be clear, I'm not faulting Nintendo for this. It's actually a clever trick made famous in games like Resident Evil. I just thought it was interesting enough to bring up. The path to Hyrule Castle is heavily guarded, so Kapora Gabora advises Link to sneak his way in. This mirrors Link to the past. The issue is that Ocarina of Time is not designed as a stealth game, so infiltrating the castle is extremely awkward. The guards are scattered haphazardly, and it isn't very clear how close you can get before they are alerted. Because there is no cover for Link to hide behind, you just have to awkwardly squeeze between invisible vision cones. I would be shocked if anyone got through this section on their first attempt. It virtually requires trial and error. The fixed perspective parts once you enter the walls of the castle are much more fair because the guards are easier to read. Upon finally meeting up with Zelda, it's hard not to be smitten with her and Link's childlike naivety. Other than her attendant Impa, none of the other adults pay any mind to her fears over Ganondorf, so it's up to the two youngsters to put a stop to him. Their optimism and resolve are adorable, but it's obvious that they are in way over their head. A very special composition called Zelda's Lullaby plays over their first interactions. Ocarina of Time has so many tracks that are incredibly nostalgic to me and I'm sure many others. I won't call them all out, but this one deserves special mention as one of my absolute favorites. It's a simple melody, but there's just this je ne sais quoi that gives it such a mournful yet calming quality. That melody forms the basis for the first Ocarina song. These are kind of like spells that can be activated at any point, by hitting the right notes to interact with the world and solve puzzles. I think it speaks to the catchiness of these little jingles that eventually you'll be able to effortlessly recall the notes to play for each song. 3 spiritual stones, like the one received from the Great Deku Tree, are needed to open the Sacred Realm and save the Triforce. The next one can be found up on Death Mountain, so that's our next destination. Kakariko Village lies at the base of Death Mountain, and warrants some exploration before rushing the main quest. The village isn't as populated as Castletown, but it feels much more real due to the actual geometry. I love the quiet, rustic vibe that you get here, but that speaks more to my personal preference than anything. Castletown might be great to visit, but I'd rather live in Kakariko. By exploring the village and checking in with the locals, you can gather a number of goodies at this point. One of my favorites is catching all of the escaped Cuckoos for a bottle, because it demands you learn the town layout inside out and fully utilize the Cuckoo's gliding ability to get to some otherwise impossible nooks. The entirely optional, but nevertheless useful, Sun Song can be found in a secret crypt in the adjacent graveyard. The ability to control the day-night cycle at will makes it well worth facing the horrifying re-dead enemies that surely are responsible for many a child's nightmare. Larger hidden areas like this just make it feel like there are no limits to Ocarina's world. Secrets could be lined behind every corner. You will also find the Skulltula House, which kickstarts a side quest that spans the entire game. This family was cursed, and the only way to break the curse is to collect golden Skulltula tokens scattered throughout the map. Some can be found right out in the open, but most are well hidden in crates, trees, or simply difficult to reach areas. Annoyingly, Skulltulas only appear at night. It's frustrating when you miss out on one by being in the right place at the wrong time. On the flip side, there is an audible alert when one is close by at least. I don't think you are actually intended to find each and every Skulltula, but the game doesn't make that clear up front. Collecting 50 will get you all but one of the rewards, and that last prize requires you to not miss a single one of the 100 total hidden Skulltulas. There is no checklist or any other means of figuring out which ones still remain, which makes this task nearly impossible to complete organically. I can't help being a completionist at heart, so look forward to that final mystery prize being revealed later on. You can bet I'm using a walkthrough though. I love how the game lets you advance the main quest at your own pace, and always offers meaningful side content for when you want to slow down a bit. There are some things I skipped here, but let's just continue up Death Mountain for now. Link quickly finds himself among the Goron, an adorable race of simple rock people who roll about on the ground. They are a new addition to the Zelda universe, and instantly became series mainstays. It's not hard to see why. Unlike the Kokiri, they have a visually distinct design, and a sense of culture all their own. Darunia, the chief, has given in to despair over the Goron plight, starvation. The nearby Dodongo's Cavern has been barricaded, later revealed to be the work of Ganondorf, and they are unable to mine the rocks needed for sustenance. Darunia fears that in their desperation, the Gorons would even try to take a bite out of the tribe's sacred stone. Goron City houses a warp point that transports you back to the Lost Woods near Kokiri Forest. The Lost Woods is a maze that also functions as a bridge between different realms of Hyrule through these mysterious warp points. I'm very much not a fan of these. They are such a lazy, gamey concession for the game's disjointed map that it shatters my immersion. By following the music in the Lost Woods, you can reconnect with Saria and learn a song that will break Darunia out of his funk. Even though you haven't been separated for long at all, it's cool that the game still remembers Saria and brings her back even after her role is seemingly filled. Darunia busts out some mad moves and puts his hope in Link to save the tribe. With the new Goron bracelets, Link can pick the bomb flowers nearby the cavern and gain entrance to vanquish the monster within. Dodongo's Cavern is the second dungeon of the game, and has a completely different feel to the Great Deku Tree. 3D visuals open up limitless possibilities for dungeon aesthetics, and Ocarina of Time really nails this aspect. The dungeons in this game put far more work into establishing a unique and memorable atmosphere through their music and architecture than any of the prior games, where dungeons were really only differentiated through mechanics in the best of cases. Dodongo's Cavern repeats the large central room that characterized the Great Deku Tree, and this will become a common trope in later dungeons as well. There is more than enough difference between the dungeons such that this is never a problem. A large central room just makes the most sense for a 3D dungeon, as it provides an anchor for the player's mental map to work off of. My biggest issue with this dungeon is the lack of surprises within. The dungeon follows the same 2-act structure of the Great Deku Tree, with its upper and lower area. The Eureka moment comes from tossing a bomb into the skull, which is just a less inspired version of jumping through the spiderweb. The dungeon item couldn't be less of a surprise. Obviously, the natural progression from bomb flowers is the bomb bag. And the name of the dungeon, Dodongo's Cavern, spoils the boss's identity right off the bat. Dodongo is yet another repeated boss from the original game, so fans will immediately know what to expect. Granted, King Dodongo is much more physically imposing in this incarnation, but is defeated in the exact same method, feeding him bombs. This bout with the king is very one-note in comparison to the fight against the queen. The dungeon and boss still ultimately leave a lasting impression at least. As thanks for your heroics, Darunia gifts you the Goron Ruby, the second sacred stone needed to open the gates to the sacred realm. It's worth noting that in each episode, Ganondorf attempts to snatch the sacred stone through nefarious methods, but Link ultimately obtains it through his good deeds. This holds true for the third stone as well. The childlike demeanor of the Gorons is so endearing, and this scene where they all go in for a group hug only for Link to flee in terror is just so charming. Before going after that third stone, we can climb the rest of the way up Death Mountain for a special upgrade. There are several great fairies hidden in Hyrule, and they will grant substantial buffs to Link. The one on Death Mountain gives Link the ability to pull off a magical spin attack that is sure to come in handy. With the bombs, another great fairy can now be found near Hyrule Castle. This one provides Link with the destructive Din's Fire spell that can lay enemies to waste in a flash. Some of the other buffs Link can gain from other great fairies include a larger magic meter, more defensive capabilities, and spells matching the other two goddesses. Nehru's love acts as a barrier, protecting Link from damage like the Cane of Birna did in Link to the Past. Feyroor's Wind is an interesting one, which allows Link to set up a custom checkpoint anywhere in a dungeon, and return to it at any point. This spell in particular opens up a lot of creative possibilities, and is a worthwhile addition. I consider myself more tolerant of aged graphics than most. I haven't even complained about the nauseating 20 FPS that the game runs at. But the less said about the hideous Great Fairy design, the better. At least the game never forces you to interact with these abominations, and does a good job at rewarding the brave souls that do seek them out. Back to the mainline progression. Our quest for the 3 sacred stones brings us to the Zora's domain. By following the river back to its source and proving your connection to the royal family, the waterfall splits open to reveal the secret entranceway to the hidden home of this aquatic tribe. The Zora aren't brand new additions to the series like the Goron were, but they might as well be. In the prior games, River Zora were merely common enemies found in the waters of Hyrule, with no more pomp than an Octorok. Link to the Past provided hints that the Zoras were more intelligent than other enemies, but didn't fully commit to the idea. In Ocarina of Time, the Zora are given a much more human-like design and society. They are now nearly unrecognizable from their origin as a simple monster. The Zora domain has a pretty simple layout, and there really isn't too much to do here other than perfect your high dive, but it's a memorable area nevertheless. It's just a really cozy cave, and the game makes great use of a simple light reflection effect, coupled with a soothingly tropical arrangement in the soundtrack. The King Zora laments his missing daughter endlessly, but doesn't give Link any hints for beginning the search for Princess Ruto. If players notice the warp gate below the pool's surface, they will be warped to Lake Hylia right next to the required key item, a letter in a bottle from Ruto. If a player fails to notice this gate, I have no idea how the game expects you to stumble upon this letter. Although it's been open for exploration to the south of Hyrule Field since we exited the forest, it's entirely possible that a player isn't even aware of Lake Hylia's existence. For all the times Navi and Kapora Gabora interrupt gameplay to explain something that is brutally obvious, it's so strange that there is no guidance when progression isn't actually totally clear. To add insult to injury, the owl does make another one of his unwelcome appearances after the player has already stumbled upon the lake to offer already known exposition. This appearance acts as a failsafe just in case players weren't able to find Zora's domain, but I don't think many players, if any, will struggle there. The struggle was in finding Ruto's letter, but no help was offered at that point. It's frustrating when the game doesn't seem to understand when guidance is actually needed. It offers unwanted assistance whenever it's unnecessary, but withholds it when it actually would be appreciated. Upon hearing that Lord Jabu-Jabu, the guardian god of the Zora, has eaten the princess, King Zora moves aside with great urgency. And allows Link access to the third dungeon, inside Lord Jabu-Jabu's belly. But not before another needlessly obscure step, with no hint or assistance of any kind. Somehow, the game expects you to figure out that Lord Jabu-Jabu will only open his mouth if Link presents him with a fish. Don't even get me started on that one. The absolute best part of this dungeon is how well it conveys the feeling of being in the belly of the beast. The fleshy walls and dangly bits all over are totally disgusting, but never let you forget where you are. The dungeon item is the boomerang, a tired series staple. This item feels redundant with the slingshot already offering ranged utility. The boomerang's arc and return are completely inconsequential in 99% of use cases, and its only utility is purely because the slingshot is artificially gimped during the dungeon. When you first attempt to take out a floating jellyfish enemy, or stun one of the moving fleshy platforms with your slingshot, you might be confused why it doesn't work. The only reason being that the boomerang had to have some use. It's abundantly obvious that it is a filler weapon that is only here thanks to its history with the series. Thankfully, the dungeon features a completely separate mechanical gimmick in Princess Ruto. Upon locating her, the bratty princess immediately commands Link to carry her out of the dungeon. Besides being a hilarious image, this is a fantastically creative way to characterize the princess through the gameplay. At the end of the day, the puzzles using her could have just as easily been implemented with an inanimate box, but the idea to use the princess herself as the weight to hold down buttons is so much more fun. Even if it was their goal, the design team couldn't have come up with a more boring, nondescript boss for this dungeon. Baronade is completely forgettable and a massive step down from the likes of Goma or Dodongo. After escaping the innards of the whale, Rudo finally realizes something we all knew long ago. Link is a total hunk. In return for saving her, Link asks for the Zora Sapphire, but he gets much more than he bargained for. The main objective thus far has always been to collect 3 spiritual stones. With that checklist completed, the game probably wants you to feel accomplished, like it's time to fight Ganondorf and finish the game. Obviously, this isn't the case. Link's nightmare from the beginning of the game replays in real time, and Ganondorf demonstrates that Link is far from ready to face off with his immense power. Despite being chased away on horseback, Zelda still finds a way to teach Link the Song of Time, and give him the Ocarina of Time, finally exposing Saria's heartfelt gift for the knockoff crap we all knew it was. Toss that outdated junk out for the new model. Jokes aside, I don't understand why there had to be multiple ocarinas. Why couldn't Zelda just teach us the Song of Time alone? There's no reason we needed to get a new ocarina as well. They function identically in gameplay. Anyway, Link can now open the gates to the Temple of Time. This sequence is simply epic. There's no other way to describe it. I get chills upon entering the cathedral and hearing that iconic Gregorian rendition of the Song of Time, knowing what's to come. What lies within the temple but the Master Sword? It's a bit of a cheat because nothing in this game sets up the Master Sword as anything special, but it's assumed that players will be familiar with it from one of gaming's most legendary moments in Link to the Past. That moment is quickly eclipsed by Ocarina of Time's version of the drawing of the Master Sword. As a longtime Zelda fan, it's all so perfect. But what begins as a triumphant moment quickly twists into just the opposite as Ganondorf suddenly reveals himself, having followed Link into the temple and now gained access to the Sacred Realm, the Triforce, and unlimited power to shape the world in his image. Link awakens to find himself in an unfamiliar adult body. Rauru, heavily implied to be the same spirit that guided Link as a child in the form of an owl, catches Link up with some heady exposition. Because Link was still a child, he wasn't yet ready to wield the Master Sword as the hero of time. Therefore, he was put to sleep for 7 years until he was fit for the task. During that time, Ganondorf has completely transformed Hyrule into a world of darkness. Rauru, together with the other sages, might be able to suppress Ganondorf's power, but Link will have to locate them all first. Thus setting the stage for the second half of the game, and 5 more dungeons. Ocarina of Time bears many similarities to Link to the Past, but this is the one that bothers me the most. The 2 games share the exact same structure, wherein Link tackles 3 dungeons to obtain a set of 3 MacGuffins, then obtains the Master Sword, and transforms the world in some way to open up another set of dungeons and associated MacGuffins. I'm not saying this is the case, but the way that Ocarina mirrors Link to the Past at every step can at times make you feel like the former is a remake of the latter. There's no reason that the series should already be constraining itself to such a strict formula. A mysterious new character, Sheik, appears out of nowhere in the temple to provide encouragement and guidance to Link as he embarks into a dangerous new world. Obviously, there will be much more to say about Sheik down the road. The first hesitant steps in Castletown are incredibly unsettling. This used to be a lively, cheery square, and now look at it. If you try and visit Hyrule Castle, hoping to find Zelda, it's clear that this isn't the Hyrule you once knew. It's a shocking transformation to say the least. However, it's also the most dramatic transformation in the entire game. Link to the Past's Dark World was a completely different map from the Light World. In Ocarina of Time, the past and future Hyrules don't actually differ as much as this first glimpse would have you believe. Instead, most of the changes come from Link himself, character interactions, and overworld puzzles. Before we continue along the main quest, I'd like to go through each of these. The most obvious difference between the 2 time periods is obviously found in Link himself. The player avatar is radically different between the 2, and that gives a different feel to the game. The chiseled, especially around the nose area, Grown-up Link contrasts strongly with Child Link's exaggerated proportions. Both are so iconic that Super Smash Bros. Melee actually included Link and Young Link as separate fighters. Where Young Link looks ridiculous cowering under the Hyrule Shield, it fits Adult Link like a match made in heaven. It makes sense that Young Link would be unable to use the weapons that Adult Link eventually acquires, but it's arbitrarily frustrating that Adult Link loses the ability to use the trusty slingshot and boomerang. As cool as the contrast between the two Links is, there is so much more potential for creativity in his interactions with the dramatically altered world around him. It's remarkable to me that the entire Epona side quest is left as optional content, because it does a fantastic job exploring the effects of time travel. As a child, the player likely visited Lon Lon Ranch, a family farm operated by Talon and Malon, father and daughter, as well as a disgruntled hired hand, Ingo. Malon and Talon are once again examples of the fun callbacks the Zelda series can't seem to get enough of, in this case mirroring Marin and Terran from Link's Awakening. Talon is even still rocking the plumber look. Malon seems interested in the mysterious fairy boy when he stops by the farm, and is excited to introduce him to her equestrian friend, Epona. When Epona acts a bit shy, Malon shares a special song taught to her by her mother, Epona's song, that immediately calms the little horse down. The story of Lon Lon Ranch is then put on hold until Link returns post-time jump. Now the family farm has been overtaken by Ingo with Ganondorf's blessing, and the charm has disappeared along with its previous owners. All Ingo cares about is profits, and he charges through the nose for horse rides. Epona, the fastest horse, has grown wild in the absence of Malon, and won't let anyone on her back. That is, until Link returns and plays a familiar tune for her. With Epona, Link bests Ingo in a race, and the thoroughly humiliated loser ups the ante by challenging Link once again, but this time with Epona as the prize. It's only too easy for the pair, and then after one last desperate attempt from Ingo to salvage the situation, Epona is free. Link can now ride her across Hyrule Field whenever he wants. This is admittedly not as useful as one would think, as a set of fast travel ocarina songs are gradually learned around this point in the game that are far more efficient. I use these fast travel songs begrudgingly, however. They don't have the same magic as the more simple ocarina songs, and feel more like entering in random cheat code inputs than playing timeless melodies on an instrument. Racing through the vast Hyrule Field on Epona may not be as fast, but there is something to be said for the character and epic game feel only a horse can offer. Epona didn't need to be included in the game, and she isn't required to finish the game, but Ocarina of Time wouldn't feel complete in her absence. Although less exciting than character moments, the two different worlds separated by time also interact through simple overworld puzzles. In the past, Link can spread some seeds in special soft soil, found throughout Hyrule. Then, 7 years later, if he remembers where the seeds were buried, he can return to find a matured plant that can whisk him Jack and the Beanstalk style to some hidden area and often a heart piece. This is about as complex as it gets, other than some fun main progression time jumping that I'll detail when it comes up. Overall, this is a disappointing level of connectivity between the past and future worlds. If you recall the type of puzzles present in Link to the Past, where you were jumping back and forth between the light and dark worlds in real time in order to exploit the differences between the two landscapes, Ocarina of Time comes up far short in comparison. Part of that comes from the fact that the only way to switch between past and future is by returning to the Temple of Time, so those specific Link to the Past style puzzles aren't possible. As always, I assume this is due to technical aspects of the hardware, but that doesn't change the limited effect it has on the game's puzzles. Back to the main quest. Sheik has instructed Link to return to Kakariko Village. I guess with Kapora Gabora out of the picture, this task falls to her. I mean him. Sheik is definitely a him. I don't know what came over me there. After exploring the changes that Kakariko has seen since you last visited, one big change is obvious. The keeper of the adjacent graveyard is absent, apparently deceased. Jump into his grave and Dampé wants to race through the catacombs. I guess his spirit is feeling really sprightly after leaving that sluggish, decrepit body behind. If you are able to keep up with him, he passes along the invaluable hookshot. This is easily my favorite item in the game because it has so many functions. It can be used to stun in combat, grab faraway items like the boomerang, and, most exciting of all, it allows Link to drag himself through the air. Like pretty much all of the items in Ocarina, this is a returning item from the top-down games, but it's given so much more importance in 3D. Before, it could drag Link over 2D gaps or grab items on a 2D plane. The third dimension expands on both of those massively. The game nudges the player to tackle the Forest Temple first, but actually allows you some options. While I'm boring and typically stick to the more telegraphed, intended order, I always love to see some degree of freedom resurface in the series. At this point, you can choose to return to the Kokiri, or the Gorons for your next dungeon. You could also catch up with the Zoras, but you won't be able to complete the Water Temple without the bow, which is found in the Forest Temple. I'm completing the Forest Temple first because it seems most natural to return home after the time jump. Kokiri Forest now has a more oppressive atmosphere and is overrun with monsters. The Kokiri themselves have been subjugated by the fear of this invading evil, but as perpetual children are otherwise unchanged. As a Hylian, Link has grown up, and isn't even recognized by those he spent his childhood with. Saria defended Link when the other Kokiri accused him of killing the Great Deku Tree, but hasn't returned from the depths of the forest since. Link once again braves the Lost Woods, a heavily guarded maze, and the limitations of the game's camera system. These massive moblins feel wasted here. This big boy in particular could have been a great mini-boss. The Forest Temple is probably my favorite dungeon in the game. The temple feels more like a creepy haunted house, and the way you navigate both its interior and outdoor courtyard is different from the game's other dungeons. Even the limited graphics of the N64 successfully craft a striking setting. I really love how much of the temple has been overtaken by nature. The gimmick of the dungeon involves finding the four Po sisters, who scatter when you first enter the central room and hide in paintings throughout the dungeon. These ghosts are named after the March sisters of Louisa May Alcott's classic, Little Women. As a massive fan of this work, I couldn't miss the chance to point this out, and also to recommend the 2019 film adaptation by Greta Gerwig. Back to Zelda. This dungeon is the first in Ocarina of Time to feature small keys again. These were a cornerstone of dungeon design in the 2D games, and it's funny that you don't even really realize their absence until they are reintroduced in the Forest Temple. The dungeon item is the Fairy Bow, a pretty standard weapon used for hitting eyeball switches, only really given usefulness because the game arbitrarily disables use of the slingshot as Adult Link. I might otherwise be disappointed with the bow, but the dungeon also makes heavy use of the newly acquired hookshot, so it's almost like there are two dungeon items. The Twisted Corridor is an awesome idea and memorable visual, but it isn't utilized to its full potential. I could see an entire dungeon designed around flipping the rooms around to walk on the ceilings or something. Maybe in the next game. What was already a fantastically crafted dungeon is made all the better by an incredible boss to top it off, Phantom Ganon. The fake out where you initially think you are suddenly being faced with Ganondorf without warning is priceless. This is such a stressful encounter where you aren't sure which painting he will appear from, and are frantically spinning about looking for your attacker. After the painting phase, you are treated to a classic Zelda tennis match. I love the chilling message from Ganondorf after the fight, reminding you that the real deal is still out there and will be far more deadly. Saria is revealed to be the Forest Sage, to the surprise of no one. At this point, you can probably guess who some of the other sages are likely to be. It's predictable to use familiar faces from Link's childhood adventures, but the alternative is a collection of new faces, like Rauru, that the player has no connection to. It's revealed that a new Deku tree has sprouted, and peace has returned to Kokiri Forest. From here, I could head to the Goron or to the Zora, but I'm going to mirror the child progression of forest, fire, water. So let's see what troubles are afflicting the Goron. Upon returning to Goron City, you'll immediately wonder where everyone disappeared to. Only one Goron can be found, and he isn't too hospitable. A carefully timed bomb explosion can force him to stop rolling and start talking. This is Austin, a name given to him by his father Darunia, to honor the great hero who saved the Gorons 7 years earlier. On the technical side, it's obviously incredibly easy to fill in this character's name with whatever the player entered when beginning a save file, but the effect is priceless. When insert name here of the Goron introduces himself and the reason for his name, it's simultaneously humorous and touching, and gives you concrete evidence that your heroic deeds haven't gone unappreciated. In your absence, Ganondorf has rounded up all of the other Goron like livestock and brought them to the volcanic heart of Death Mountain to feed the newly revived terrible dragon of old, Volvagia. Darunia's forefather had once vanquished Volvagia with a legendary hammer, so Darunia set out to repeat history and save his people. Unfortunately, he hasn't returned. After hearing Austin the Goron out, you are given the heat-resistant Goron tunic and access to the Fire Temple within Death Mountain Crater for Rescue Mission Part 2. After another cryptic meeting with Sheik and a new fast travel song, you can attempt some spotty platforming in an area that feels largely unfinished, or just mainline the Fire Temple. The dungeon does actually play out like a rescue mission, where you encounter caged Gorons and are rewarded with a key and a hint for each one you free. This gives the dungeon a bit of an identity, but the effect begins to suffer from diminishing returns rather quickly. By the 9th Goron, I'd rather just have the key, to be honest. Like the Death Mountain Crater, this dungeon's geometry doesn't feel as intelligently designed as the rest of the game. Things just feel really haphazardly strewn about, and there are lots of awkward jumps to make. I guess that's befitting the heart of a volcano, but I still don't care for it. This room in particular reminds me a lot of Lost Izalith from Dark Souls, and if you know anything about Dark Souls, you know that is not something to be proud of. The boulder maze makes clever use of its fixed camera angle to hide secrets, and is much better implemented than the dungeon's other maze, where unpredictable walls of fire materialize to slow your progress. The atmosphere of the dungeon is frustratingly dependent on which version of the game you are playing. The original release features this haunting chant to the instrumental track. The vocal element was sourced from free-use sound effects, and can actually be translated as an Islamic prayer. The vocal element was removed, likely out of fear of religious controversy, from all future releases, including the 3DS remake, and what's left of the Fire Temple theme feels empty and boring in its absence. I do understand why Nintendo would choose to remove it, but the fact remains that the dungeon's atmosphere was better with it included, regardless of the real-life context of the track. The dungeon mini-boss, Flare Dancer, has a very forgettable design, to the point where every time I play this game, I swear I've never seen him before in my life. In contrast, I find the room where you find the dungeon item extremely memorable. The room itself feels like a pedestal, placing appropriate significance to the legendary Megaton Hammer that once saved the entire Goron race and will do so again in your hands. I don't love the item itself because its use is relegated to a small number of heavily telegraphed instances. Other items often have creative puzzles designed around their use. That isn't the case with the hammer, and I rarely if ever use it outside the walls of this dungeon. There is an attempt at replicating that memorable Eureka moment of falling through the spiderweb in the game's first dungeon, wherein you use the hammer to knock a pillar down to the lower floor, where it can be used as a platform to get to the boss, but it obviously lacks the same magic. The dungeon boss Volvagia feels a little underwhelming to me after all of that build-up, but I do appreciate the whack-a-mole design of the fight, a fun callback to Adventure of Link's Barba. That being said, way too much of this fight is spent just waiting for Volvagia to land and make itself vulnerable. It's not a bad boss fight per se, but it's definitely not a strong one. Darunia is formally introduced as a sage and bequeaths another medallion to you. You already know the Zora are up next. Just like Goron City, the Zora domain is a shell of its former self when you return. Everything, including King Zora, has frozen over, and Ruto is nowhere to be found. At least this time the king is frozen in a more convenient spot, and you can access the fountain at the top of the waterfall. Curiously, Jabu-Jabu is nowhere to be found either. It's never explained what became of him. With the help of the new ice platforms, Link can reach a previously inaccessible cavern, which constitutes one of several mini-dungeons in the game. I'm definitely not a fan of these, and Ice Cavern might even be the worst one. Very little of the careful design that the main dungeons so proudly feature trickles down to these bits of filler. The Ice Cavern in particular is home to every sort of annoyance the game can throw at you. Slippery traction on ice, a particularly pestering set of enemies and hazards, and lots of backtracking to refill on the blue fire needed to melt the red ice. After clearing the ice caverns and melting King Zora, you'll gain the potent combination of the Iron Boots and Zora Tunic that allow you to stay below the water's surface indefinitely. The logical location to test out this newfound power is obviously Lake Hylia. Sink to the bottom and enter the source of many abandoned save files, the dreaded Water Temple. To be honest, I personally think the reputation of this dungeon far exceeds its actual difficulty. The Great Bay Temple in Majora's Mask gave me much more trouble if we are comparing water dungeons. That isn't to say it's easy or anything, it's still by far the most challenging dungeon in Ocarina of Time, and I definitely struggled a bit the first time around. But now that I've mastered its inner workings, I respect the dungeon more than any other in the game. The Forest Temple is still my favorite, but I really admire how much the Water Temple tests the player's spatial reasoning. It's extremely demanding, but always logical and fair. I could devote an entire video to the Water Temple's design, but to summarize, the dungeon is partially submerged and consists of 3 floors. By playing Zelda's Lullaby at designated points throughout the dungeon, you can raise or lower the water level. Rooms become accessible or blocked depending on whether the floor is flooded or not. The kicker is that the spots that allow you to change the water level are far removed from the block paths they open up. This requires the player to be extremely intentional in how they manipulate the dungeon. A player who just runs around without a plan will find it impossible to make any progress, and this is where most players struggle. The dungeon is like one massive puzzle box in the way it puts your mind to the test. The one flaw I will concede is that the process of fiddling in the menu to swap the Iron Boots on and off is extremely cumbersome, and really hurts the pacing of the dungeon. Other than that, the dungeon is just chef's kiss, as the kids say. The dungeon item, the long shot, is nothing more than an upgraded version of the hook shot, but the hook shot is great, and you could kind of count the Iron Boots as a dungeon item too, so even that isn't much of a weakness. The surprise return of Dark Link from Zelda 2 is most welcome, even if he would have been a better fit for the upcoming Shadow Dungeon. The fight is definitely pretty awkward and basically requires you to cheese it with the hammer or magic. But how could you possibly complain about this? The atmosphere here is off the charts, and it's an incredibly memorable encounter. Dark Link totally overshadows the actual boss of the dungeon, Morpha, who is actually a pretty cool boss in her own right. I love the way the game introduces her with this creepy POV sequence. The fight makes great use of the dungeon item, and Morpha's simple but nevertheless unnerving design sticks with me. I remember frantically trying to climb out of the water anytime I fell in when I was a kid. Definitely don't want to be swimming around with Morpha in the pool. It's cool to see Ruto all grown up now as a sage, and I love how she still hasn't gotten over her infatuation with our boy Link. Between Zelda, Saria, Malon, Ruto, and maybe even Navi, Link certainly has no lack of choices. Now that we have finished repeating the forest, fire, and water dungeon theming, the game gets a bit more interesting. The final 2 dungeons can be tackled in either order, but I'm going to go with the more typical choice of tackling the Shadow Temple before the Spirit Temple. If we return to Kakariko Village after beating the first 3 adult dungeons, the town is in flames. An invisible evil spirit has escaped from its prison in the well, and makes a fool of both Sheik and Link. Impa, the sage who originally had sealed the monster, has gone to the Shadow Temple to try and contain it again. Before we run in after her, there is an important bit of gear we will need to make the eventual rematch less embarrassing. If we jump in the well now, there isn't anything for us to find. But that might not always have been the case. It is possible to enter the well in the past, and this is one of the few times where the game really makes great use of the time travel aspect. If you talk to the man in the nearby windmill, he seems to hold a grudge with an Ocarina kid from 7 years ago. Apparently, this kid had played a strange song and turned the windmill all screwy. Obviously, this doesn't ring a bell, but by returning to the past and putting the Windmill Man's story into action, we can drain the well through the mill and uncover what lies within. Time paradoxes are so cool to me. I've always loved trying to puzzle them out in my head, but obviously you can't really make logical sense of something like this. The only reason Link learned the Song of Storms, killer tune by the way, and played it as a child is because the Windmill Man told him that he already had. The event has no origin. Any story featuring time travel will inevitably feature some nonsensical paradoxes, but I consider it a fun feature rather than an inherent problem. We've been in the adult timeline for so long, with no reason to return to the child one, that it might surprise players that there is actual new content in the child timeline that will help them progress in the adult one. It's so pleasant and quaint running through the familiar areas, briefly restored to their former luster before Ganondorf came to power. Once we enter the bottom of the well, one of the better mini-dungeons, it isn't so charming. I love the contrast with everything else in the child timeline. Dead Hand, a terrifying monster that lies within the well, is straight up traumatizing for young Link, as well as for any younger players, I'm sure. The gimmick this area revolves around is tricks of the eye, illusionary walls, invisible paths, and the like. The item found within, the Lens of Truth, is vital in making your way through its tricky corridors and the upcoming Shadow Temple. It also has some really creative uses outside of the main progression, like this guessing game. What used to be an almost impossible proposition, picking the correct chest 5 times in a row, 5 50-50s, which makes the odds 1 to 32, becomes laughably trivial. Before Link gets any other delinquent ideas, like getting a hold of a sports almanac, let's jump through time again and head to the Shadow Temple. Before you even enter the temple proper, there is this curious instance where Din's Fire is required to ignite a room of torches simultaneously. Din's Fire is the easiest of the spells to acquire, so I don't think many players will have trouble here, but none of the spells have been required at all up to this point. Din's Fire is also required within the dungeon at exactly 1 point, so I understand they wanted to make sure you had the spell prior to entering, but that's just a band-aid fix without actually resolving the underlying issue. If a player for some reason hadn't collected Din's Fire from an earlier Great Fairy, it's incredibly unreasonable to punish them for it this late in the game. If the spell was going to be required for anything, there should have been an item gate soon after it's found, to ensure players don't progress too far without it. What this strange room speaks to more than anything is some grander vision for the spells that was probably scrapped in development. There is evidence that each medallion Link acquires would have had an associated spell that would be used within its dungeon, which explains where this quirk originated. An interesting glimpse behind the curtain, sure, but a frustrating design fault at the same time. The game acts like the Lens of Truth is also required to enter the dungeon, but it is actually possible to complete the entire thing through trial and error and skip the bottom of the well entirely. I wouldn't want to do that personally, as the dungeon plays many of the same tricks as the well did, but it's really cool that it is allowable within the game's structure. On that note, the Shadow Temple feels largely like an extension to the well, even down to a Dead Hand rematch. This is quite the compliment to the mini-dungeon, that it approximates one of the game's core dungeons, but more so it speaks to the dumbed-down design of the Shadow Temple. While other dungeons are complex structures that loop back on themselves, often non-linearly, and must be puzzled out as one grand, all-encompassing challenge, the Shadow Temple is a simple gauntlet of puzzles and combat encounters, each limited in scope to a single room. There doesn't feel like any cohesion in the structure of the temple. While the central room design motif is a bit overplayed in the game, you definitely feel its absence here. The locked doors in the dungeon are all just one after another, which limits the explorable space at any one time, and removes any decision making. This is true of some earlier dungeons too, but the linearity was at least masked better then. I don't think it is a coincidence that the last couple dungeons end up with the laziest layouts. Obviously concessions have to be made often in a game's development to hit deadlines and budgets, but when judging the games as art rather than as a commercial product, I'm not going to let these issues slide. Just like in the bottom of the well, the game pushes its E for everyone rating to the absolute limit with oppressive imagery and atmosphere. In the name of transparency, an E rating back in 1998 is a bit different from an E rating today, because the ESRB hadn't added the E10+ label yet. Reprints of Ocarina of Time actually removed the blood that paints the walls of this dungeon. Again, I obviously prefer the original uncensored version that you're seeing in my footage. The dungeon item is the hover boots, but the Lens of Truth kind of does support duty because the hover boots are a really poor item. They allow Link to float in the air for a brief moment when running off of a ledge, which sounds way cooler than it is in practice. While using them, Link's traction is reduced and he feels disgusting to control. They are just as cumbersome to equip as the iron boots, but thankfully, the dungeon doesn't require swapping them on and off as often. The biggest issue is that in order to design the dungeon around its item, much of the Shadow Temple is created out of disjointed floating platforms, which just adds to the lazy design the dungeon suffers from. I will admit that I like the implementation of these big fans to cross large gaps while hovering, however. The weakest dungeon in the game has a strong finish at least, because the fight against Bongo Bongo is fantastic. The arena, a dark, featureless realm housing nothing more than a larger-than-life drum, is masterfully chilling. He can be a real challenge, and I love how the game is consistent with the brief tease we got of him escaping from the well. Bongo Bongo is invisible, and can only be seen with the Lens of Truth. If you really want some gamer cred, try taking him out blind as a personal challenge. You might think the hover boots would help here, as you get bounced about on a massive drum, but I find them to be more of a hindrance than anything. I typically rely on the bow to take the boss down, but you can get creative with other items or even just your sword if you like. The disembodied hands have definitely been done before, including in sister title Super Mario 64. But the creepy body and face to go along with the creepy hands, coupled with the invisibility and built-up lore, makes this one of my favorite bosses in the whole game. Bongo Bongo really deserves a better home, because the monster himself is 10 times more memorable than his temple. There's no question that the game pushes you to complete the Shadow Temple prior to the Spirit Temple, but when Impa bequeaths you her medallion, it fills the final slot rather than the next one. Bit of a fun fact for you, but not so fun for me, because I always complete the two in this order, and it drives me crazy seeing the empty spot and wondering why this is the case. Let's quickly rectify this quirk by pushing right along in the main quest. The game has never taken us to the western zone of the map yet, but that's about to change. The broken bridge here prevents entry into Gerudo Valley as Child Link, but with the help of Epona or your trusty Longshot, it shouldn't prove much trouble for Adult Link. It's exciting to have a totally fresh area of the map to explore after spending so much time in familiar locales. Before reaching the Spirit Temple and having a chance at the final medallion, Link has several desert challenges to overcome. First is infiltrating the Gerudo Fortress. The Gerudo are a hardened all-female desert tribe feared throughout Hyrule. It is said that once every 100 years, a male is born to the tribe to lead them. Our villain Ganondorf is this chosen one. Despite this making literally no sense if you think about it for more than a couple of seconds, it makes for a pretty unique culture and some interesting perspective on Ganondorf's backstory, just before Link finally gets another shot at him. The fortress presents us with yet another stealth mission, even harsher than the previous ones. The game just doesn't give the player the tools needed to make these stealth sections fun, and the repetition of fighting 4 identical Gerudo thieves to rescue 4 identical carpenters does little to disguise the filler nature of the Gerudo Fortress. After countless trial and error attempts at navigating the fortress without being spotted, you'll eventually be recognized for your accomplishments, with a Gerudo membership card, formally allowing you to walk freely amongst them. The next challenge is simply crossing the desert that lies between you and the Spirit Temple. After carefully grappling over the quicksand, you'll find yourself in the middle of a desert storm, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. The Gerudo have placed flag markers that you must follow to not get lost. The game does a fantastic job at making this setting feel unique and incredibly harsh. It's a small moment, but I love when you finally reach the little shelter and can escape the elements briefly. This desert storm obviously only exists within the context of the game, an ancient N64 game at that, but I still get this warm, cozy feeling in here. Something like this is what sets Ocarina of Time apart from its contemporaries. It really nailed the vibe of each area and makes Hyrule feel truly alive. It created a world to get immersed in. Unfortunately, we can't hide in here forever and must brave the outside again for the last trial before the temple. The flags we relied on before are gone, and in their place is an invisible Poe. With the Lens of Truth, keep up with her winding path just like with Dampé earlier in the game, and you'll make it to the Desert Colossus hidden in the heart of the desert. The engravings at the entrance reveal that this dungeon is going to be a little different. You must return here as a child to retrieve the silver gauntlets before you can progress the rest of the way as an adult. In my Link to the Past video, I bemoaned the fact that the game never utilized its central gimmick of jumping between dimensions to create unique dungeon challenges. At first you might think me ecstatic at a dungeon actually utilizing the time travel mechanics, but it's really not as special as it sounds. Because you can only time travel at the Temple of Time, it's basically just a dungeon split into halves, instead of one that requires time travel to be used dynamically to tackle uniquely designed puzzles. It's really nothing different from what happens with the bottom of the well and the Shadow Temple, just with the two halves smushed together into one dungeon. So while Ocarina does at least technically use its central gimmick in a dungeon, it's relegated only to a single one, at the very end of the game, and is very limited in scope. So not all that special after all. How do you get here as a child, you ask? Good old Sheik makes another surprise appearance to teach you a fast travel song. Feels like a bit of a cheat to me because young Link can't organically traverse the desert. But what are you going to do? Each time Link learns one of these songs from Sheik, there is a brief but dramatic cinematic accompanying the moment, and I have to give special mention to this one. Between the vastness of the surrounding desert and the presence of the owl, still watching over Link after all that has happened to him, this cinematic in particular feels incredibly epic. The scope of this title never ceases to amaze me. After returning as a child with the Requiem of Spirit fast travel song, we are introduced to Nabooru, at this point in time a rebellious Gerudo who refuses to recognize Ganondorf as king. She asks Link to bring her the silver gauntlets so she can thwart his plans. Only Link is small enough to crawl into the dungeon, so he's on his own. To be honest, what follows isn't a very exciting dungeon. It's very linear and doesn't feature any sort of navigation challenge or anything grander than single room encounters. I do like these Anubis enemies, who copy your movements and task you with figuring out how to lead them into the fire. Alternatively, you can just run up and burn them yourself, but where's the fun in that? The Iron Knuckles are another new enemy, and are easily one of the toughest. Destructible environments were even incorporated to really demonstrate their strength to the player. Another interesting bit is the fact that this dungeon is the first one that bomb chews are actually used in a puzzle. You remember those guys, right? From way back when you first entered Castletown as a child? Other than the bomb chew bowling minigame, this puzzle where you blow open the ceiling is the only point in the entire game where their unique properties are actually incorporated into a challenge. After locating the silver gauntlets, you'll witness two evil witches under Ganondorf's command capture Nabooru. These two, the twin sisters Kotake and Kume, are actually Ganondorf's wet nurses, who raised him into the monster presently threatening Hyrule, so they're kind of a big deal. With Nabooru out of the picture, the job predictably falls to Link. Gotta do everything ourselves, right? Return as an adult so you can use the gauntlets to open up the second half of the dungeon. In this half, the dungeon motif manifests, manipulating light. Remind me why there isn't a light temple to go with the light medallion? These puzzles seem tailor-made for such a dungeon. The dungeon item, the mirror shield, is used alongside sets of stationary mirrors to reflect light to these sunspots. The mirror shield is a great item because it doesn't need to be equipped. It's just an upgrade to Link's core moveset. It's obtained so late in the game that it isn't really taken advantage of outside the dungeon, but I'd love to see more items like this that don't need to hog any of the buttons, and are just permanently active. Burn the sexy snake lady's face away to reveal Kotake and Kume huddled over yet another iron knuckle. Take it out only to uncover a brainwashed Nabooru under the armor. Now that's going too far. The next room allows us to exact our revenge on the witches in a fantastic boss fight. I'm realizing now that I've raved about most of the bosses in this game, and it's for good reason. They are categorically a great group. Twin Rova is probably second only to Bongo Bongo for me. There are actually two stages to the fight. One of the witches, Kume, is a master of fire magic, while her sister, Kotake, wields ice magic. In the first stage of the fight, you must use the mirror shield to reflect one's cast magic to her sister. The two are each weak to the other's elemental magic. After a few rounds of this, the two shake it up and combine their powers and their bodies into a single corporeal sorceress, the titular Twin Rova. Now the mirror shield is once again put to use, but now to absorb the elemental magic until the right moment when you can blast it back in Twinrova's face. A genuinely hilarious scene that sees the two bicker even as they leave the mortal realm caps off a great fight. Nabooru is the spirit sage, and she presents Link with her medallion, yada yada yada. Nabooru obviously got the least screen time of any of the sages, save Rauru, but they did a great job building up her character in such a short span of time. She can totally stand tall alongside Saria, Darunia, Rudo, and Impa. With all the medallions under our belt, all that's left is taking down Ganondorf at his castle. However, I'm going to slow us down to savor the game a bit before we roll credits. We've just ran through a bunch of dungeons back to back, with little break in between, and that isn't really indicative of the typical Zelda experience. When I'm playing, I like to take my time just immersed in the incredible world the game has crafted. Even after all I've covered up to this point, there is still a huge chunk of side content I haven't even touched. Obviously, try as I might, this video will never truly be exhaustive. Exhausting, maybe, but not exhaustive. Nevertheless, I would be remiss to not discuss some of the more interesting side content, if only briefly. To a kid in the 90s, this game must have felt like one without limits because there are so many hidden areas and items that might have sounded fake when you first heard about them. But no, they really are in the game. For instance, you can unlock the ability to power up your arrows with fire and ice. It's never required, but it's undeniably awesome. Ice arrows are unlocked by completing the Gerudo training grounds, yet another mini-dungeon. Fire arrows are discovered by solving a riddle in the middle of Lake Hylia, one of the only times that the game puts its novel day-night cycle to use in a non-binary way. These could have come in handy against Twinrova. Just like with the spells, there is evidence in the game's files that there were originally going to be elemental arrows for each of the temples, but all that remains of that idea are the optional fire and ice and the light arrows that are mandatory for the fight against Ganondorf. Speaking of Lake Hylia, how have I neglected to mention the fishing game? Being more of a horseback archery guy, I find the activity dull and a bit frustrating, but it does wonders for expanding the game's scope. It's not hard to imagine some players getting hooked on the minigame and spending hours in this room alone trying to catch that elusive Hylian loach. There's a small mask trading side quest that obviously pales in comparison to what would follow in the game's sequel, but it is a really cool case of, likely unintentional, foreshadowing. The Happy Mask salesman tasks you with finding a buyer for a series of specialty masks he has for sale. With the number of NPCs in Ocarina of Time, this is a tall order, but it is made entertaining by a shocking amount of unique dialogue when you speak to different characters while wearing different masks. Your ultimate reward is the Mask of Truth, which allows you to speak to the gossip stones that are scattered about Hyrule. Again, the only motivation to do this is to uncover more unique dialogue, and get some secret background lore to flesh out the world that much more. You might have noticed me using a big greatsword in some of my footage. This is the Big Goron sword, and is yet another trading sequence. Unlike the one found in Link's Awakening, this sequence is purely optional. Because the world is so big and filled with so many characters, it's very challenging to do without a guide, but the prize at the end makes it all worth it. To summarize, get the pocket egg from the Cuckoo Lady in Kakariko, hatch it into the pocket cuckoo, and use it to wake up Talon in the adult timeline. Return to the Cuckoo Lady to get a special cuckoo named Kojiro. Bring Kojiro all the way to the hidden meadow of the Lost Woods to wake up this fellow. He hands over the odd mushroom which expires in 3 minutes, so Link has to hoof it to Granny's potion shop in Kakariko. Bring the resulting odd potion back to the sick man only to find him gone. Fado, a Kokiri, explains that the man was lost to the woods and transformed into a Salthos. She'll still take the medicine in exchange for the saw he left behind. Who could use a saw? That's right, the carpenters by the broken bridge by the valley. The foreman trades over the Big Goron sword, but it's unfortunately broken. Journey to the very top of Death Mountain to get it repaired by Big Goron himself. He got messed up from the last eruption and needs eye drops before he can do anything. Link brings the prescription to King Zora, but he doesn't have the eye drops, only the frog used to make the eye drops. Once again, the ingredients will spoil in 3 minutes, so you really have to optimize your route to make it to the lakeside doctor in time. You convince him the frog is not a snack and get the eye drops. You have 4 minutes to get literally across the entire map to deliver these to Big Goron. If successful, he will repair the sword in just a couple days, and then it's yours. Ooh. That was a lot, but what I like about this quest is that it ensures that you truly have explored Hyrule, and gives otherwise filler characters some purpose. The world feels more alive knowing that all of these separate background characters not only have lives of their own, but also all know each other. I also like this quest quite simply because the Big Goron sword is sick. When using this two-handed sword, you trade the utility of a shield for double the damage output of the Master Sword. Jump attacks with this thing just melt enemies. Some of the other optional items in the game I collect just for the satisfaction of 100% completion. I'm not out here using the ice arrows during normal gameplay. I collected them just to have them. But the Big Goron Sword is an item that I will always go out of my way to collect, and will absolutely have equipped whenever I am wanting for some extra oomph. Speaking of meaningless collectibles that I only bother with because I'm obsessed with the satisfaction of 100% completion, we return at long last to those golden Skulltulas. You'll recall that this side quest spanned the entire game, and the reward for this Herculean task, finding all 100 Skulltulas, was kept secret. If you are going to keep the prize secret, it better be really good, otherwise the player will feel like they were taken for a ride. With heart pieces, a series staple at this point, you know what you are getting, and each heart piece offers tangible progress because Link gets a health boost with every 4th one. 100% completing the Golden Skulltula quest has you collecting the latter 50 in a row, without any milestone incentives along the way, and with no idea what the ultimate reward for such a very frustrating task could be. Well, what do you get for completing the Golden Skulltula quest? You get a huge rupee worth 200 rupees. Now you can get infinite rupees by repeatedly leaving and re-entering the Skulltula house, but the fact remains that rupees are completely worthless at this point in the game. In fact, at least during my playthrough, they've been worthless almost the entire game. I spend the majority of my playtime with my rupees maxed out because there really isn't all that much to spend them on. Especially at the very end of the game, this is just an insult to the player for all of their wasted effort. I don't think players are actually expected to go for all 100. There are only so many to guarantee that most players will be able to locate the first 50 on their own, for the last legitimate reward. But the game also doesn't warn you about how fruitless a quest it ultimately is. Thankfully, the Golden Skulltula quest, as bad as it is the exception rather than the rule, and Ocarina of Time generally makes it worth your while to poke around in every corner and hunt down everything the game has to offer. There are so many secrets and surprises just waiting to be uncovered. This video is running a little long, so what do you say we start to wrap it up? After acquiring the final medallion, Rauru encourages us to return to the Temple of Time, where a familiar face is waiting. Sheik lays some last-minute lore on us. The Triforce has a built-in defense mechanism, whereby if found by one whose heart isn't in balance, the Triforce will split into 3 pieces, representing power, wisdom, and courage. When Ganondorf touched the Sacred Triangle, he was left with only the Triforce of Power. The remaining 2 fragments were given to those who best exemplify the other qualities. This is like Zelda 101 to modern fans, but it was new to Ocarina of Time. Sheik explains that Link is the one destined to hold the Triforce of Courage, and the Triforce of Wisdom was bestowed upon none other than Princess Zelda. This revelation is accompanied by the shocking twist that Sheik is the very same princess, in disguise to avoid Ganondorf's capture. This is common knowledge today, but I'm sure it was a really effective reveal before it became one of the most spoiled moments in video games. Up until Ocarina of Time, Zelda was treated like Peach is in the Mario games, just a damsel in distress. Ocarina changed that by turning her into an active force in the story, who shares the burden of fighting Ganondorf equally with Link every step of the way. As satisfying as it is to be reunited with Zelda, you can just imagine how difficult the last 7 years have been for her. Link had it easy being asleep in the Sacred Realm as Ganondorf wreaked havoc over her kingdom. However, just when I compliment the game for taking strides to elevate Zelda to something more than a damsel in distress, Ganondorf captures her and she becomes just that. Well, it's progress at least. Obviously, the immediate response Link has is to storm Ganondorf's castle to rescue Zelda. I wish the game spent a bit more time considering this choice, however. Ganondorf does nothing to disguise the fact that he is using Zelda as bait for Link, just as he used Link as bait to get Sheik/Zelda to lower her guard. By chasing after Zelda, Link is effectively delivering the last Triforce piece right into Ganondorf's lap. We've seen the damage he was able to do with 1/3 of the Triforce. It's unimaginable what he could do with the full thing. I'm not saying Link shouldn't rescue Zelda and take down Ganondorf, nothing of the sort. I just think this was a wonderful opportunity for the game to show some maturity in considering the options which would make the player's eventual decision to rescue Zelda, despite the risk, that much more courageous. Even with our full arsenal and the strength of the sages behind our back, Ganondorf's tower is just as oppressive as when we first laid eyes on it, although our magical rainbow bridge does hamper the atmosphere ever so slightly. Before taking on Ganondorf, we must remove 6 protective barriers he has placed that prevent you from climbing the tower. These extend from the central tower like spokes on a wheel, and correspond one-to-one with each medallion, sage, and dungeon that we tackled as an adult. It's abundantly obvious that each of these lanes is stitched together out of leftover ideas from their respective dungeon. There aren't really any new ideas here, just more of the same. Invisible platforms, ice block puzzles, light manipulation, fans, etc. You get the idea. I just realized I lied earlier when I said bomb chews were only used once in the entire game for a puzzle, because even that is repeated here. So make that twice in the entire game. You can now delete that comment that I know you typed up telling me how wrong I was. Even if these challenges are severely starved for creativity, I don't mind them. A bit of build-up before Ganondorf doesn't hurt, and it's kind of a nice trip down memory lane. One last ride before the final boss. If you struggle at any point, there is an incredibly overpowered upgrade just outside of the tower, stronger defense thanks to the last Great Fairy. This translates to Link taking half damage in these final challenges, which is essentially turning on easy mode for struggling players. If you made it this far, Nintendo wants you to finish the game. If you are able to take down all of the monsters in your way, and you reach the top of the tower, you'll find Ganondorf pounding away at an organ. Who knew he was such a Renaissance man? The suspense is palpable, now that all 3 Triforce bearers are finally in a room together. The fight with Ganondorf in his tower is definitely an underwhelming one, because it bears so much similarity to the Puppet Ganon fight in the Forest Temple. There are a few new twists like the falling blocks, his slam attack, and a blast of unblockable magic, but the gist of the fight remains the same. Just knock his attacks back at him to make him vulnerable, and then wail away. In an act of desperation, Ganondorf brings his tower down, hoping to bring Link and Zelda down with it. This is a timed escape sequence that is actually surprisingly tight if you aren't careful. It's really great to see Link and Zelda working as a team to clear the way down to safety. That safety doesn't last long because Ganondorf isn't dead quite yet. That underwhelming repeat fight is quickly forgiven, because it was just an appetizer to the Beast Ganon final boss. This is the absolute best fan service for older fans of the series, who grew up fighting the Pig Demon in earlier Zelda games. The fight is simple mechanically, but quite open-ended in how you tackle it. His tail is his weak point, and you just have to do whatever you can to get to it, whether that be sidestepping him, rolling through his legs, or stunning him with light arrows, or even Deku nuts. For what the fight lacks in complexity, it makes up for it with an incredible atmosphere. The charred battlefield underneath stormy skies, coupled with subdued yet epic music, and absolutely immaculate lighting, all produce a climax that is nothing short of a work of art. Ganon gets what he deserves, a sword through his skull, before the sages banish him to the Sacred Realm. He threatens his revenge against Link and Zelda's descendants. Like that could ever happen. Link and Zelda share a tearful goodbye as he returns to his original time, but the beautifully melancholic credits eventually shift into something more celebratory, where we see all of Hyrule's familiar faces holding one big party in recognition of your heroics. It's incredibly goofy seeing everyone dancing so carefree, but I love it. We get this great shot of the sages all together, looking over the party, and then a brief after-credits scene where Link returns to the past and meets up with young Princess Zelda, bringing everything full circle. The end. You would think that after discussing a game for this long, it would be a cinch to throw together a nice conclusion to put a bow on it. But the truth is that I'm having a tough time wrapping this video up, so I'll just keep it brief. After all, I've taken up way too much of your time as is. It goes without saying that Ocarina of Time is a very special game for me. Very few other games can procure such warm sentiments of nostalgia from me. Ocarina wasn't my first Zelda game, not by a long stretch, and I played it long after release, so I feel that the effect the game has on me just speaks to how truly special it is. It would be foolish to think that I'm the only one with these strong ties to the game. I know that it has had this effect on countless players. So, if you've played Ocarina, I'd love to hear any insights or memories you choose to share in the comments. This isn't some YouTuber like, comment, and subscribe routine. I genuinely want to hear from you and have a nice discussion on this game. If you somehow made it through this entire video without having played the game prior, feel free to chime in with your unique perspective as well. I know this video isn't perfect, I'm no master writer or editor, and this is a new format for me. However, it was a massive labor of love, and I trust that my passion has shined through. I sincerely appreciate you listening to me all this time, and I hope that you were able to find value in my thoughts, as scatterbrained as they may have been. Thank you, and until next time, take care.